it's a detailed question. At the end of the day, I apologize for being repetitive, but it is the most fundamental point that I remind folks is that through evolution, planetary evolution, through the process of photosynthesis and the reality of biology, the tree does reflect biological life in general, but we're speaking of trees. It does reflect the most scientifically proven means of which you draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you tie it up into the equivalent of sugars that later become cellulose and become the fiber that basically becomes the tree that you see. And that is done. That is carbon dioxide as a raw material. So if you think back to everything we do as humans and the footprint that each of us has, we each emit about 7 metric tons of CO2 a year in our just typical activities each. If you can imagine what product out there uses carbon dioxide as its raw material, it's a very limited list. And the reality is trees lead the list, and they got their own. We're blessed with the opportunity to learn from it. We have the opportunity to benefit from it. The key to it is that how do they contribute towards climate change? They contribute towards climate change by letting them do what they do. Use them as a crop, as I mentioned, in the working forest. But when you do so sustainably, you create the conditions where you have a constant renewal and regrowth and rebirth of forests, and that is a constant new draw of CO2 from the atmosphere and sequestered permanently. So I applaud folks like Bill Gates and a lot of the foundations that are doing the leading edge research. One day maybe there will be the magic machine that can really take it out effectively. Maybe we can sequester it better, but until then, all hail the tree. Interesting. Just took the note. There's a two-part. The vitality of students in our industry is no different than when I was talking about seedlings and reforestation, if you can imagine. Our industry is not one that students gravitate to. I do believe when I entered the industry in 1994, I'm not going to sit back and say everybody said, let's go to forestry. But at the end of the day, it didn't have a negative connotation. Youth have drifted away from our industry, and it's not hard to see. You can walk through any pulp mill, any sawmill, you can get into any operating site, and I will say most of who you'll encounter will probably be 45 years of age and older rather than being 35 years of age and younger. It is just the reality. So what is the vitality? The vitality is nothing can exist unless the inputs equal the outputs. So as you have retirements, as you have people moving on, changing careers, leaving the workforce, you need an equal amount coming in the bottom or it becomes somewhat unsustainable. So and I'm being very biased when I say this, but I'm being very honest. I could not advocate more for students that are looking for a career than to look at the forest products industry. I would almost challenge students to say, if you ever say the words, I can't find a job, I want you to email me, because this industry has jobs. The difference is I'm talking today from South Georgia. I'm in a community of about 10,000 people. So if it's an office tower in Toronto, well, guess what? 10,000 people all want that same one job. But the reality is that there's 10,000 other jobs in smaller communities, in very vibrant communities that are sitting unfilled. So for the youth, I would sit back and say, take a look at the opportunities that are out there. And please don't miss what I said. I went from engineers through the whole spectrum. These are companies. These are large-scale publicly traded companies, a lot of my customers, where every possible discipline and need it is a potential career. It's not about, do I have to be a PhD or do I have to be an engineer? Every position you could possibly imagine in any corporation is no different than in the forest products industry. So vitality is huge. My story very quickly was I was working on a Master's of Science degree. I was fortunate. It was going very well. Had a couple publications, and I figured I'm going to do a PhD. PhD was going to be in the US. It was going to be more expensive than what any scholarship was going to cover. So I took a 6-month research contract simply to make money in the forest products industry. That was 29 years later. Now, probably not the right thing to say to any parents that might be listening in terms of, I didn't go do my extra grad studies. The reality is I got into something and realized what it meant and realized that it was fulfilling. And I'll be honest, you start getting a paycheck instead of paying tuition, pretty big motivator. But at the end of the day, it was the absolute right call. When I finished the second master's, another master's degree another day. That's how I got in. I got in by default. It did not find me, and I didn't find it. I just happened to take a research contract, and I will say one thing: whatever you're going to do in life, make sure you love it, because 30-year careers is not something I could imagine doing if you enjoy what you did. But that's how I got into it. When I think of the impact of climate change on forestry, I think the demands on forestry in the past, when I say the past, let's say the 1960s, 70s, even 80s, the demands for responsibility were not high enough. And the industry, in hindsight, could and should have done better. But we can say that about a lot of things in society, right? What we see and do in 2023 is very different than what we probably said and did in 1993. Humans adapt, humans learn, humans do better. It's just the way the way the world works. When it comes to climate change, I wouldn't so much say that climate change has impacted forestry in Eastern Canada or any part of North America. I would more so say that because forest products companies were forced or at least influenced to adapt environmentally into a more sustainable manner, they were ahead of the curve. Now, I know I'm from the industry, so it's going to sound biased, but I look at companies that I've worked for in my career and things that we were doing for environmental remediation, wastewater treatment, forest product practices. We were doing so at our cost, at our innovation, and at our ability to try and advance ourselves competitively. I don't want to sit back and say, hey, we're going to save the planet in 1999. Folks were doing it to be more competitive, but there was a recognition in this industry that if you didn't do things right, you were not going to survive anyway. You don't have a tree to cut. It doesn't matter how good your product used to be, you have no raw material. So the industry, I would say, if I'm not trying to avoid the question, I'm not so sure that we got influenced by climate change. I think, thank God, the industry was out in front, did things different a little bit sooner before the world became aware that climate change really was something that we needed greater attention, because the industry was ready to move forward even more so than it had. So I may be not hitting the question, but that would be my opinion on it, in the sense that I think we were at the forefront. Lots of mistakes along the way, but at least had been started, so that as it became more of a global issue, more of a global concern, the industry had already had, let's say, a decade plus of innovation and learning and wanting to do better, and quite frankly had. So yeah, that would be the answer, hopefully hitting the question. Different countries, different rules, obviously. I'm much more versed in the US versus Canada, but to the point being, when you're working on your own private land, folks tend to, not human nature said, when it's yours, you run it a certain way. Canada's forested lands that are used by the forest products industry very much are predominantly crown land, government owned land, of which the forest products company do not own, but they have the rights to harvest from. Because of that, you may not have the most optimal location of where your harvest rights sit. So if you can imagine a smaller country, let's say a Sweden or a Finland, or let's just say a generic country with a smaller area, and you're saying, I'm going to do intense forestry here, you can put roads in that are permanent. So you sit back and say, I've got the road in and I'm going to harvest this block. And through the rotation, I will come back here in 50 years and harvest again. But at least there is some degree of arteries and whatnot in place. In Canada, we have got the benefits and beauty of the country. And let's face it, these countries have much smaller climate windows because they tend to be smaller countries. When you think coast to coast in Canada, in the east, it's a lot of swamps and bogs and whatnot that have to get, you have to traverse to be able to properly harvest. When you get in the west, you could be on mountain slopes. So it's not something where you could prescribe and say, geez, I wish we could do this, because Canada is so diverse just in geography. There's not one solution to all. But what I would love to see is more government support for the forest products industry to operate some areas with more permanence of roads, permanence of bridges, support for maintaining that infrastructure more than what we see today, simply because the more efficiencies that we can put into the industry, the less rework, the less revisit, it's better for everyone. Because at the end of the day, if something is going to be sustainable, the other thing it needs to be is profitable. And I know that may be not the statement you would typically hear from someone that is climate and environment aware. But if you really want to succeed in the battle of climate change, you have to find a way that it can sustain itself. And part of it sustain itself is companies earning enough money from their core business to be able to reinvest and do these things. I just think other nations tend to put a little bit more emphasis on assisting the companies with the how. And I don't mean assist directly, here's money. That's not what I'm asking. The regulatory, the needs, the demands, structured in a way where you can go out and competitively do what needs to be done. Don't make the hindrances, I don't want to use the cliche, but get more of a hand up to assist with what you're doing, not necessarily a handout of cash. That's not what I mean by assistance. There are things I think we can do along the regulatory side that would be much better. One example, purely generic. If we want to conserve, let's say 1,000 acres of land, old growth, coastal cedar, whatever it may be, we want to protect for all the right reasons. And trust me, the industry understands those reasons. As a government, why not sit back and say, look, we got to protect this 1,000 acres, but we're going to go create or assist with 3,000 acres somewhere else that will be accessible to the working force. Put together models where we do the right thing for the one, but put a multiplier on it so that we get better everywhere else, and we're adding more trees and more raw materials towards the working force. That's where I'd like to see Canada go. I think most countries and a lot of environmental groups focused on got to protect, can't do this. Could be 100% right. But when we do that and we take that out of the system, you probably impacted a community, a family somewhere that may have been deriving income or some socioeconomic benefit for that. Let's go make sure we create that opportunity somewhere else. And I always use a 3-to-1 model, because that way there, even if you're not perfect on your math, you're still further ahead. You start doing things 1-to-1, it's just trading. You say 1-to-2, yeah, did you get it right? I always say 1-to-3, you'd be safe. I would look for government initiatives that for everything we do on conservation and protect, let's go do 3 times that on create. The 2 billion tree commitment is a fantastic initiative. It's a fantastic idea, but it is somewhat of a headline as opposed to a product at this point. Something of that magnitude takes time to roll out and get correct. The mechanism of getting it is something where, if I was looking at it through a government lens, what they're attempting works, it makes sense. But the reality is, by not making those trees directly applicable to, say, the larger users of trees today, forest products companies, for example, what you're asking is groups that maybe have never planted a tree before or managed a forest to suddenly come forward with projects that require trees. Great idea. I would not say no to those folks. But if you can imagine, if you've never done it before, you're probably starting on a scale that's about this big. And yet you've got industry out there that works at a scale like that today. I would find a mechanism to balance the two out and say, how does 2 billion trees support today's industry to get more trees in the ground? Because let's face it, these companies are experts at what they do. They know how to roll out a planting program. They know how to get a tree planter. They know how to have efficient tree planting. That's critical. Where the struggle is coming right now is because we're not really focused on the industry planting the trees, it's coming out in small projects, and it's going to be very hard to add up to 2 billion. Now, some of the funding goes to things that I think is actually destructive to reforestation. If I look at things like drone seeding, for example, a lot of folks like it. It's a lot of capital money out there, and it sounds real cool. You send drones in, you throw a bunch of seed down, and say you're going to reforest an area. The reality is, the funding that goes to things that are not proven, like drone seeding, is actually fruitful to the 2 billion tree program. When you seed by drone, your success rate is about 10 to 15%. So to say it another way, if you seed by drone, you run the risk that you're going to throw away and destroy 80 to 85% of the seeds. The actual raw material, that critical raw material that everybody needs, gets wasted. And you get about 10% success rate, and eventually a tree planting company is going to go buy a forest seedling like we produce and go out and have to put it in. So it really creates a delay, and it influences dollars and resources to go towards things that maybe aren't going to be as beneficial at the time as you hope. My comment is we're a few years into the 2 billion tree program. The ability to hit that gets tougher every year that passes, because now you need more and more trees in a single year to catch up. It's something where I think it's time that the forest products industry and the companies that are established in the forest products industry have more opportunity to access those trees, bring them into conventional lands, and at least get that flow moving. Nothing stops us from having a second 2 billion tree program Why don't we just get the first 2 billion in, figure out our model and our mechanism, master it, and we'll be even better next year. Very slow outside the gates. Hopefully we're going to see an acceleration. Fantastic question. The forest products industry as a whole has always been innovative. Now, I will say, having joined PRT a little over a year ago, the forest seedling industry has innovated, but very much doing things the way they have traditionally. And if you can think of growing, a potted plant, for lack of a better word, it's not always intuitively obvious. Geez, how would you do that better? How do you innovate a tree? The innovation is not necessarily from the tree. The innovation is going to come from how do we better create it? So is there a better potting medium? Is there a better fertilization? Is there a better mechanism to help that tree get its start? When you think of Quebec, and please don't quote me, even though I'm going to say it, but in the Quebec industry, they tend to plant a lot of 2-year-old trees. So most of our customers are buying trees that are 1-year-old. In Quebec, they buy them if they're 2 years old. My understanding is that the Quebec industry is starting to consider going towards a 3-year-old tree. And when I say the Quebec industry, really the Quebec government from a regulatory standpoint. So now you're going from seedling to 2, we're getting pretty big. So the question becomes, why would you do that? Well, the bigger the tree, the higher you are off the forest floor on day 1. The ability of a tree to grow is really just an access to nutrients, water, and sunlight. So the shorter you are, weeds and other things start stealing your sunlight. If they get ahead of you and you're below it, the tree can't grow, it doesn't get enough sun. The tree starts out on top, it gets the sun, it gets bigger, the weeds don't get to grow, and you have a quicker acceleration towards a tree to grow. So when you think of innovation, it's not necessarily innovative to say I'll put an older tree in, but it is an interesting concept that says it's a better way to potentially get a forest with a higher success rate. And to the comment that I think Lily might have asked it, if not Camilla, that you did, when you think of wildfires and things of that nature, the sooner that a forest is tall and big, less things grow underneath, that's where the wildfires really come from. It's not the big standing green tree that's the problem. It's all the dead stuff on the bottom. So helping the forest canopy get out a little quicker is something that I would sit back and say, maybe not innovative in the scientific standpoint, but certainly innovative in the process standpoint. The recent company that we just acquired in the US Southeast, one of the big things that drew us to them is that they do very, very natural genetics. And I say natural genetics, this is not GMO. Genetics where you take a male tree and a female tree of visible, obvious properties and make sure that the pollen and the seed find each other and make yourself an offspring that has that look. Tremendous advances in the US Southeast using very simple genetic techniques of just a known male and female to make a known progeny. This is something that I sit back and say Canada has, I would say, done very, very little of. There's only one forest products company that I know of that undertakes that level of interest and that level of scientific advancement. It is something when you look down the road and you say, look, as long as it's all done naturally, which is all it is, it's just pollen and seed, why not make a tree that's less susceptible to disease, less susceptible to forking on, at year 1 and all of a sudden it splits in the first windstorm and dies. These are things that I think in Canada there would be a strong need for. The problem that we have is sometimes, the US Southeast has got a small geography. They want to get lots out of it. They invest. Canada's got a big geography. We get spoiled by our size sometimes, so we don't figure out how can we do better because there's always one there. But these are areas where I think the industry overall will find itself over the coming years. With ourselves internally, what we're working on and innovation-wise is looking at overall how we can better automate. And that's not because we do not have a love of people, but you asked earlier, youth coming in and the availability of folks that want to work in industries, it gets tougher and tougher. Innovation around automation is better for all, more efficient, lower cost. The lower a tree cost, the more trees that will get planted. That's a good natural pull if we want to get more trees out into society. So we are working more towards our mechanization and our means of growing trees and how do we do better. But as I said, advancement in genetics, I do believe is something within the next decade is going to take greater prominence, because if we're going to sequester more carbon, you're going to want trees that grow faster. Just add to that, Justice, I don't have the data, but I would encourage folks to look it up. If you think of what an acre yielded, say, 30 years ago from a food crop basis, and you look at what you get today off the same acre, it's the same point you would make with trees. At the end of the day, the earth is able to sustain itself because it's producing more food per acre today than it did yesterday and than it did the day before. That is where I do think the forest industry will find itself over time. It's inevitable. I mean, if we're going to mitigate climate change, we need more, or we got to get the ones we have currently growing faster. Enough. That's a well-loaded question. That might be a whole discussion on its own. It's going to go back to what I said earlier, and I truly believe this. Canada as a country and our folks and our population, we need not be apologetic for being a natural resource-based economy. That is the reality. We can have all the great jobs in office towers, working for banks and services and all those other great industries that are out there. But we need to stop apologizing for having natural resources. We have to stop apologizing for utilizing natural resources. What we have to start doing is embrace the fact that's who we are. That is a massive part of our GDP. It could be even bigger part of our GDP. The reality is we want to invest in things that are globally more attractive, right? We're going to bring in, and don't get me wrong, all these industries, everything has a benefit. It's not a question of don't go there, go here. It really is about a case of we've walked away from our natural wealth. We've walked away from our natural strength. We've walked away from our natural position. We should always be thinking environment. We should always be thinking to protect the most vulnerable. But you also sit back and say, how do I use what I have most effectively? And if I sit back and say, think about how eventually you'll have families of your own, but think of your families and your childhoods in the past. Every home had a different set of conditions. And they took decisions based on the conditions, whether they were weak or they were strong or they were in the middle. They took decisions that were based around what are our conditions. And I think in Canada, where I get frustrated, I guess I'm frustrated by it. I get frustrated by the fact that we have natural wealth in our forests. We have natural wealth in oil and gas. We have natural wealth in minerals. We have natural wealth in sectors, fisheries and oceans. The reality is we avoid those things because we feel like we have to justify using them. Well, the reality is I would much rather see a tree cut in Canada sustainably, responsibly, and used in the right manner than see the next one fall in an Indonesian rainforest or somewhere out in the Amazon through illegal logging, because they're not replanted. It's just scorched earth. Life goes on, and whatever happens, happens. Mother Nature comes back in 100 years, great. Mother Nature doesn't come back, don't care. When cut the next day acreage. In Canada, we got to embrace the fact that we are amazing. We are amazing at what we do. We do it right. We do it in a standard that everybody should aspire to do. And most countries with proper forest products industries do work to the similar standard. I've worked in Europe, I've worked in the US, I've worked in Canada. I'm not going to say that those jurisdictions have any massive minuses relative to Canada. The difference is don't apologize. Embrace it. It is what we have. Do it right. We should be held accountable. If we are doing it wrong, people should call us out and call us out hard. But the reality is we haven't done it wrong in decades. We are setting the standard. We're not trying to catch up to a standard. We are the standard. We are working towards that standard. So I would advocate strongly. I look at groups like FPAC and Derek Niver and all the great folks over there and what they do. They understand and they advocate for the industry and they advocate very well. So my comment is, as Canadians, as all you future voters, do not apologize for natural resources. Expect investment in natural resources. Your jobs ultimately come from natural resources. Because in Canada, a bank just moves somebody else's money. At some point, you got to create that dollar. And you're going to create that dollar by either taking some oil out of the ground and turning it into a product, taking mineral out of the ground, turning it into a product, harvesting a tree and turning it into a product. But at some point, you've got to generate something. It can't just be a service all the time. You have to generate something tangible at some point. And that's the piece that I think we've lost over time. We're trying to say sorry when really we should be saying, look at us. That would be my call.
Awesome. That's very well said, and I couldn't agree more. So I guess, yeah, that about wraps up, and I think that was a perfect way to finish. I don't think there's any better question that we could have ended on than that one. So thank you so much, Randy, once again for coming in and speaking with us today. It was really informative and partly inspirational too. I think a lot of our listeners will find a new perspective on, who we are in Canada and maybe hopefully change a few minds and people will look at our country a little differently after that one. So thank you so much for coming in, and yeah, I'll let you kind of have the last word here before we end it off.
My last word is thank you. Thank you for organizing it. Thank you for what you were doing. Thank you for advocating. And I'm dead serious. If somebody's saying they can't find a job, email me. I will point you at 4 or 5 companies, and you can just, from there, you take it on your own, because I have no doubt you'll find something. It's there. It's the world's, it's the most amazing industry we have in the country. We just got to get more folks into it. So thank you.
Awesome. All right. Anyone looking for a job? Contact Randy Fournier. We'll get in contact with us. We'll get you his email. So
awesome.
Great. All right. Well, that has been this week's Food for Thought, and we'll catch you next week.